Welcome to the book of Abraham. Oh, I'm so excited to go through this book. We've got so many notes, so many wonderful things to understand about Abraham that we just want to jump right in on this and get going. Another fantastic book in the Pearl of Great Price. We did a video talking about the Pearl of Great Price, kind of an introduction video a while ago. Please watch that to learn more about the origins of the book of Abraham. We will get into that a little bit, but we want to mainly focus on the stories in this book and what is there for us. So to begin, as we look at this, this is a comment that Hugh Nibley made that just helps to put a little bit of context behind this book of Abraham that we have. And he's talking about a type of ancient document known as an Ascension text. He said, an Ascension is an ancient apocryphal text that describes the ascension into heaven or cosmic tour of a patriarch, prophet, apostle, or other religious figure, with his subsequent return to earth to reveal what he has seen and experienced. Sometimes the terms assumption and testament are used to describe the same thing. The Book of Abraham is a classic example of just such a text. So when you look at ancient texts, there is a type of text, kind of a genre, if you will, called the Ascension texts. And this is you could call the Book of Abraham the Ascension of Abraham if it had been found by archaeologists. So this is a type of text that's talking about how the prophet sees a grand vision and of the cosmos, and they learn about the universe, and basically they're getting an understanding of the whole plan of salvation, kind of going through the endowment ceremony from the temple. So it's a genre that's out there, and there's lots of these stories that are out there. We have it for Abraham. Moses kind of had one as well. We heard Enoch has had one that he talks about in the book of Moses. We know most of the major prophets have had these types of visions or revelations or dreams given to them. So very powerful type of document. So that's what kind of the genre of the book of Abraham is basically. Brigham Young Religious Education Department in 2020 had an interesting thing that they said about this book, the Book of Abraham. They say, an archaeologist who was with Napoleon's team goes back to Egypt and finds a large trove of mummies. So this is a little bit more of the history of how we got the Book of Abraham, basically. So this goes back to the times of Napoleon is what this story is that's here, basically. An archaeologist who was with Napoleon's team goes back to Egypt, finds a large trove of mummies. He takes some home for his own collection, but dies in the journey home, so his wife ends up hiring a company that ships the collection to America, where a person acting like an agent of the owner takes them on tour to display them for money. Now, there's a couple of different perspectives of this story of how we got the Book of Abraham that does exist out there. Most of it corroborates pretty closely. Who the owner was is a little bit different, but they're talking about how there was a whole ton of mummies found. They excavated into the side of this hill, and they found a lot of mummies. They pulled them out. Some were on the ground and badly decayed. Some were up on stone beds, basically. They were elevated off the ground, and they were well preserved. In some of the mummies and in the sarcophaguses and things, they were looking for treasure, and a lot of times they didn't find a whole lot of treasure, but they found scrolls, and that's one of these mummies had these scrolls in it. So the guy that's on this tour finds out about Joseph Smith, brings them to Joseph, and after reviewing the papyrus, offers to purchase them. LDS scholars think there were two papyrus, one long one of 40 feet and a second one of 20 feet, with some pieces of other papyrus. Joseph says they contain the writings of Abraham and Joseph, but we never hear anything else about the book of Joseph. So the Religious Education Department put that statement out, talking about the origin of the book of Abraham. This was in 2020 that they released that in one of their articles. I think it's on their website, in fact. You can look that up. But they claim, from what this is, that Joseph believed that Abraham's book and Joseph's book were here. Joseph would be his great-grandson, basically the son of Jacob. But we don't hear about that at all. So there were some papyrus that were found. We don't have the complete amount of them. After Joseph and the people around him, the other apostles and people had utilized them, and then after Joseph's death, they fell into the ownership of Emma, and she and her second husband basically sold some off, and others they kept, some they gifted to other people. So they kind of got split up around that time, and we're not sure if we have all of them back or not. What we do have back resembles more of what we know as the Book of the Dead. It's a very common book that was buried with mummies from Egypt. So we'll probably get into a little bit more about that later as well. But I want to share another quote here. This one's a little bit of a long one, and Hugh Nibley, of course, is the originator of this quote. He's talking a little bit more about this Book of Abraham and the authorship and authenticity of this book. And he says, "Two important and peculiar aspects of ancient authorship must be considered when we are told that a writing is by the hand of Abraham or anyone else. One is that according to Egyptian and Hebrew thinking, any copy of a book originally written by Abraham would be regarded and designated as the very work of his hand forever after. No matter how many reproductions had been made and handed down through the years, the other," so that's the first point basically, is if it's a copy of the original book, they just assume it was written by Abraham, even though it literally was not written by Abraham. It was somebody else copying what Abraham wrote. It's considered the same as the original. So it's hard to tell which one is the original because they all claim to be an original. Another one here, the other is that no matter who did the writing originally, if it was Abraham who commissioned or directed the work, he would take the credit for the actual writing of the document, whether he penned it or not. So this is another point that's important, that sometimes people would commission a writing to be made. They wouldn't do the writing. They basically hired ghostwriters to write the book for them, and then they just put their name on it. That still happened in the ancient days. So this could be a book that maybe Abraham said, "I want you to compile these writings together," and then he put his name on it. This is one of the challenges of trying to understand authenticity. So Hugh says here, he says, "As to the first point, when a holy book, usually a leather roll, grew old and worn out from handling, it was not destroyed, but renewed. Important writings were immortal. For the Egyptians, they were the divine words. For the Jews, the very letters were holy and indestructible, being the word of God." So this is really interesting. So you think about it, over time, the papers, whether it's a parchment paper or animal hide, the leather or whatever the document was written on, over the years of unrolling it and rolling it and being exposed to the sun and the heat and elements and things, it goes bad. It just wears out. So instead of losing it, what they would do is make a copy of it. And of course, that would then be seen as the original. Even though it wasn't the actual original, it would be seen as if it was the original. But because, as he says in here, he says, the wearing out of a particular copy of Scripture, therefore, in no way brought the life of the book to a close. It could not perish. In Egypt, it was simply renewed, fairer than before, is what they would say, and so continued its life to the next renewal. Thus, we are told at the beginning of what some have claimed to be the oldest writing in the work, which is the Shabako stone, really cool stone worth looking into for Egyptian history. Quote, "His Majesty wrote this book down anew. His Majesty discovered it as a work of the ancestors, but eaten by worms." So the Shabako stone was written on a different type of material, but was copied to a stone because the original was being destroyed by worms. So it goes on, "So His Majesty wrote it down from the beginning so that it is more beautiful now than it was before." So that's a quote about the Shabako stone. So Hugh Nibley says, "It is not a case of the old books being replaced by a new one, but of the original book itself continuing its existence in a rejuvenated state. No people were more hypnotized by the idea of a renewal of lives than the Egyptians. Resurrection was a massive deal in their philosophy. Not a succession of lives or a line of descent, but the actual revival and rejuvenation of a single life. But, written by his own hand, this brings us to the other interesting concept. Let us recall that supposedly oldest of Egyptian writings, the so-called Shabako stone, begins with the announcement that His Majesty wrote this book down anew. This, Professor Seth obligingly explains, is normal Egyptian usage to express the idea that the king ordered a copy to be made. Now, yet it clearly states that the king himself wrote it. Thus, when the son of King Snefru says of his own inscription at Medum, it was he who made his gods in such a writing that it cannot be effaced. The statement is so straightforward that even a student as W.S. Smith takes it to mean that the prince himself actually did the writing. And what could be more natural than for a professional scribe to make an inscription? Quote, it was her husband, the scribe of the royal scroll, Nebui, who made this inscription. Or when a noble announces that he made his father's tomb, why should we not take him at his word? It depends on how the word is to be understood. Now, Professor Wilson in all these cases holds that the person who claims to have done the work does so in the sense that he commissioned and paid for it. The noble who has writing or carving done is always given full credit for its actual execution. Such claims of zealous craftsmanship have loftily ignored the artist, writes Wilson. It was the noble who made or decorated his tomb, though the noble of the Old Kingdom breaks down enough to show us how these claims were understood. I made this for my old father. I had the sculptor Itu make it. Those are some quotes. Dr. Wilson cites a number of cases in which men claim to have made their father's tombs, one of them specifically stating that he did so while his arm was still strong, or with his own hand. Credit for actually writing the inscription of the famous Metternich stele is claimed by the prophetess of Nebuen, Nest Amun, daughter of the prophet Nebuen and scribe of the inundation, Ankh Psametik, who states that she renewed this book after she had found it removed from the house of Osiris, Menevis, so that her name might be preserved. The inscription then shifts to the masculine gender as if the scribe were really a man, leading to considerable dispute among the experts as to just who gets the credit. Certain it is that the lady boasts of having given an ancient book a new lease on life, even though her hand may never have touched a pen. So when we read the Book of Abraham written by his own hand upon papyrus, we are to understand that this book, no matter how often renewed, is still the writing of Abraham and no one else. For he commissioned it, or, according to the accepted Egyptian expression, wrote it himself with his own hand. And when Abraham tells us that you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning, we do not need to suppose that the patriarch himself necessarily drew the very sketches we have before us. It was the practice of Egyptian scribes to rephrase obscure old passages they were copying to make them clearer. And when this was done, the scribe would add his own name to the page, which shows how careful the Egyptians were to give credit for original work only. Whatever the first author wrote remained forever by his own hand. So when they would write, whoever was writing could write it down, and they would oftentimes say, this is written by my own hand, to signify I wrote this versus I commissioned it. And so what Hugh Nibley's getting at in here is, in here, the translation of the Book of Abraham, it says written by his own hand. So this is authentic as far as what is put in there. But oftentimes scribes, when they would recopy these down, the images and things, they would change it, or they would update the understanding, interpretation of it to help make it clearer to the reader. So they're translating it as they go. But then they would usually put their name in there that they did that, and show that here's what the original did, here's what I did to update it, or things like that. But they were really meticulous and careful at making sure that they took care of this. And even though it might not have, the scrolls, the actual scrolls that Joseph Smith had, might not have been the original actual scroll that Abraham wrote on. They copied down what Abraham wrote to preserve it in a more updated medium, is a possibility as well. So really interesting, really interesting. Now there's a book that exists known as the Apocalypse of Abraham. This is an ancient writing that does exist. Archaeologists have discovered it a while ago. And it actually is another book claiming to be a book about the life of Abraham. So apocalyptic writings are similar to the Ascension writings, that they talk about the grand vision that these prophets had, oftentimes of the future. So the book of Revelations really could be named the Apocalypse of John, because that's what it is. It's talking about the end of the world type stuff. So this Apocalypse of Abraham is a similar type of document that's out there. So it is a document that came through archaeological discovery and translation. So it's really a fascinating book to compare with our book of Abraham. So here is a little quote to understand this a little better. The text, originally published in Russia in 1863, was first made known to the West in an 1897 edition of Bonneswetsch, which he produced a German translation in 1898. And in the same year, the first, and for many years, the only English version appeared in the first volume of the Improvement Era. So he's talking about the Apocalypse of Abraham. It was found and translated into Russian first, most likely because Russian archaeologists probably discovered it. Then it was translated later to German, as German people took the Russian interpretation and things and translated it. And then it was later translated into English for us to read, but it was actually put, one of the first places it was put in English was in LDS materials to understand it better, which is really cool. It is significant that it was the Latter-day Saints who first made the Apocalypse of Abraham available to the world in English. It was they who first recognized the Book of Enoch in Parley P. Pratt's review of 1840, not as a worthless piece of apocrypha, but as a work of primary importance. Now, there's a little bit of history in this from background, okay? Parley P. Pratt and others, when the early apostles went to England for missionary work, they went there to spread the gospel. Several of them came across an English translation of the Book of Enoch. It was a translation from the Ethiopic version of Enoch that they found. It was discovered hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, they discovered an Ethiopic translation of the Book of Enoch. But because they had this other document called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they had the Old Testament stuff and things from the Jewish writings, they believed that the Book of Enoch was a rehash back in like the 1200s. It was just a rehash of old documents. It's not worth anything. So they just basically stuck it, because it's an ancient document. They didn't want to get rid of it. So they put it in the basement of the museum. And it was in the early 1800s that a Franciscan monk was in there doing research and studying and other things in the museum. He came across the Book of Enoch in Ethiopic. And he said, why is not this translated to English? We need this book to get out to the world. It is a phenomenal book. So no one would touch it because they believed it was a stupid, terrible rehash of a book. It's not worth it. So he translated it painstakingly himself into English. And it wasn't until the 1840s, so after Joseph Smith had given us the Book of Moses, that the English translation of the Book of Enoch found its way into the hands of some of these early apostles. Now, that Book of Enoch never made it to America until many years after Joseph had died. So Joseph never made it to Europe, and the Book of Enoch never made it to America. And of course, Joseph already given us his 2 chapters on Enoch before they even realized that that book existed. Parley P. Pratt and others had read excerpts out of it and had their hands on it in England, and they were writing to Joseph saying, this is amazing. We found the Book of Enoch. Listen to this. Here's some great stuff out of here. So that was after, again, Joseph Smith gave us the Book of Moses, where we have the 2 chapters from the Book of Enoch, chapters, I believe it was 7 and 8. So this is really kind of a cool story about what's going on. But that's what he's talking about here is everybody thought it was worthless. And Parley P. Pratt's like, this stuff isn't worthless. So when they came across the Apocrypha of Abraham, the Latter-day Saints jumped on it and worked on encouraging that to be translated into English and be shared with the world. So he says, but while the Book of Enoch suggested only the Book of Mormon to the brethren, the Apocalypse of Abraham from the first brought to mind their own Book of Abraham. Brothers Edward H. Anderson and Arte Hag, who made an excellent translation of Bonnesweck's German, remarkably close, in fact, to Box's official English version of 1919, detected in the text many things of a character both as to incidents and doctrines that ran parallel with what is recorded in the Book of Abraham, given to the world by Joseph Smith. They wisely contented themselves, however, with printing the text without commentary other than 3 or 4 passages in italics, trusting the Latter-day Saint reader to think for himself. So when they found it and they translated English, they didn't try to make a Mormon perspective on the Apocalypse of Abraham. They just tried to translate the book itself and allowed people to come to their own conclusion as to what was in it. So it's really cool history that this ancient document, the Apocryphon of Abraham, matches in a lot of similarities with the Book of Abraham that Joseph has given us. And realize the Apocryphon of Abraham came after Joseph had already given us the Book of Abraham. So really cool stuff. I'm more convinced, if you haven't watched the videos on Moses, make sure you watch those. But really, the pearl of great price between the Moses and Abraham, the Articles of Faith, the Joseph Smith Matthew, the pearl of great price is probably the single best example of the prophetic value of Joseph Smith being a true prophet than even the Book of Mormon is. We don't have a way to corroborate the stories in the Book of Mormon because we don't have the archaeological evidence and we don't have any ancient records from ancient people in North or South America that necessarily really connect up to it well. We have some anecdotal stuff, but nothing really firm like what we get from ancient Egyptian writings. We have ways of backing up the Book of Moses. We have ways of backing up the Book of Abraham and even the Book of Enoch. And Joseph has given us some powerful stuff that really prove that he was a true prophet of God. So these are great books that give us tremendous insight, which is really, really cool. All right, let's finally start this chapter. All right, chapter 1, Abraham seeks the blessings of the patriarchal order. He is persecuted by false priests in Chaldea. Jehovah saves him. The origins and government of Egypt are reviewed. So this isn't starting when Abraham was young. All right, this is starting when he's older and he's living in Chaldea with his family, and then of course they move away from there eventually as well. So you can read a little bit of the story in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis about Abraham as well. The Apocryphon of Abraham has a lot more about his childhood in there, that he was a pretty smart kid. A lot of the legend says that if you followed in the book of Genesis, there we tell some stories talking about how Abraham was a similar person to like Moses and Jesus, in that it was kind of prophesied that a great king would come among the people. And so the king at the time of Abraham, it would have been Nimrod, or around that time, he killed all the kids to get rid of, just like in the story of Moses. They killed all the kids to try to get rid of Moses. Herod tried to kill all the kids to get rid of Jesus, and it didn't work. Abraham was kept in a cave, and he was miraculously fed and nourished by angels, spiritually and physically, and taught. And because he basically grew up and learned how to live without people, he probably was a bit of an introvert type of a person, but amazing stories of what he did. And he really, even when he was younger, getting into the family business, because his dad, Terah, was a sculptor, and he built idols that people would buy. So he would make idols and sell them, and people would get these idols and put them in their carts and put them in their houses and carry them, little small totems around with them to worship the gods, basically. And they had an idol for all kinds of gods to do all kinds of things. And Abraham just looked at this and went, "This is stupid. This is stupid. You guys, I don't, why are you following this?" You know, there's a story, and I think it's in the Apocryphon of Abraham, that he was sweeping and he bumped one of the gods, and the gods fell over and the head fell off. And he said, "Well, if you're a great God, why don't you put your head back on?" And it couldn't do it. And he realized it's just a piece of stone. It's not a god. People are worshiping stone. It's nothing. So, but of course his dad didn't like that. So his dad tried to have him killed. And that's where some of the stories come on, and his brother Haran was killed instead. So let's get into this. Verse 1, in the land of the Chaldeans, at the residence of my fathers, I, Abraham, saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence. So he realized early on, I don't fit in with these people. Bunch of idol worshipers. They do all this crazy stuff. They're not following God. They don't understand, how the universe works and things. They don't get this. I got to go somewhere else. So he wanted to leave and move on that. In fact, this is from the Improvement Era, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a little bit of excerpt talking about Abraham, and I don't have which Improvement Era it came from. So you can guess if it's the Improvement Era, it's pre-1990s, I think. It used to be called the Improvement Era, 70s and 80s, and then they changed it to the New Era in the 90s. So it's a little bit older. Excuse me. So this is what they say here. The ancient and honorable designation of Abraham as he who came forth from the fire of the Chaldees has been explained by almost anybody who has had access to a Hebrew dictionary as a misunderstanding of the expression Ur of the Chaldees. Thus, one of the latest commentators writes, Ur of the Chaldees, not then known to be a place name, was translated by the rabbis into the fire of Chaldea. But the fiery element is not so easily brushed aside. References to sacrificial fires in the Abraham tradition, such as the Haran episode and the story of the fire bricks, are much too numerous and explicit, and the historical parallels too many and too obvious to be traceable to the misunderstanding of a single monosyllable. The constant references to both the sacrificial knife and the fire make no difficulty, however, since the normal procedure in human and animal sacrifice in Egypt, as elsewhere, was to cut the victim's throat, then cast the remains on the fire. So they're talking about how when he was from Ur of Chaldees in that area, like somebody's from the city in this state, they kind of made it sound like he came out of a fire in Chaldees, which they say is kind of a misinterpretation of what the words meant. But also they did a tremendous amount of sacrifices back then. In fact, the story goes that Nimrod burned 70,000 babies and people trying to get rid of Abraham, and they never could. And at one point he possibly did get put into the fire, but miraculously survived, just like the stories in the Book of Mormon around Alma and Amulek and the people in some of those stories. So here's another quote from Hugh Nibley in his book, Abraham in Egypt. He says, that country in the Haran region, which the Bible calls Aram of the two rivers, was Naharina, which Martin Gemmell describes as the classic land of the Chaldeans between Ararat and Mesopotamia, which contained that Ur in Haran, which the Ebla tablets now identify as the most likely home of Abraham. It was a land that figures largely in the dynastic histories of the New Kingdom of Egypt, and important members of the royal family came from there. The annals of the great 18th dynasty have much to say of the heroic pharaohs and their daring campaigns in that part of the world. Their stories depict the conquerors in a formal, ritualistic capacity consistent with their divine callings, but at the same time are full of romantic and human excitement. Thus, Amenaphis II, I might have brutaled that, sorry, while telling how the Mitanni and Naharina brought tribute to him, takes special pride in his personal prowess with the bow, in which he excelled even the chiefs of the hill tribes of retinue. His son, Amenaphis III, married the famous Queen Tai, the daughter of a great prince who ruled from Karay in the south to Naharina in the north, and later took to wife also the famous daughter of the lord of the Mitanni. To his forefather, the great Thutmose III, the lands of Chaldea, Naharin, and Shinar, the biblical Shinar in northern Mesopotamia, all brought their trouble together. So these are lands, these are real places, and you'll probably want to look in the Bible dictionary under the maps to look up where some of these places might be. But there's a lot of connections with Egypt in there, and Abraham spent a lot of time in Egypt and dealing with them. So that's kind of the area where he was. Now let's go to verse 2. And finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for the blessings of the fathers, meaning patriarchs, the rights of the priesthood and things, and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same, or the priesthood, having been myself a follower of righteousness, desiring also to be one who possessed great knowledge, and to be a greater follower of righteousness, and to possess a greater knowledge, and to be a father of many nations, a prince of peace, and desiring to receive instructions and to keep the commandments of God, I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers. So he left knowing, I need to leave, I got to get out of here. And he wanted to look for more righteousness. How can I live the gospel more? How can I be better at following the commandments? How can I understand God more and what he wants for me? How can I learn the gospel more? Boy, wouldn't it be nice to meet more people like that today? Instead of going, how can I get out of church more? He's saying, how can I go to church more? How can I do more with the church? How can I be more involved? That is Abraham. That's Abraham. Now, verse 3, it was conferred upon me from the fathers. Okay, so there's something we need to learn about that. It came down from the fathers from the beginning of time, yea, even from the beginning or before the foundation of the earth, down to the present time, even at the right of the firstborn, or the first man, who is Adam, or first father, through the fathers, unto me. I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed. So he's saying, basically, the priesthood has always been here. It was before Adam, it was given to Adam, and has continued through the great patriarchs ever since. And he wanted to partake in that as well. Now, Hugh Nibley, in his book, A New Approach to Abraham, has this to say about this idea of the fathers. He says, there is a strange, almost obsessive concern with the fathers at the beginning of the book of Abraham. It was conferred upon me from the fathers. It came down from the fathers from the beginning of time, our first father through the fathers unto me, etc. This is just as conspicuous in our extra-canonical sources as Theodore Rake would trace this fervid appeal to the fathers to an ancestor cult closely resembling the Egyptian system, which crops up in the earliest Jewish tradition but has been consistently discredited and suppressed by the rabbis. So this statement, this idea of through the fathers, using the fathers, this line of authority is very common in apocryphal writings, but a lot of the people, scholars, are like, nope, it didn't happen. It's not real. But it shows that what Abraham's talking about here is right. He says, the Genesis Apocryphon lays great emphasis on the line of the fathers, and the rule of the community designates the righteous in Israel as those who have a claim on the fathers. Studies of the name of Abraham point to the dominance of the concept. According to DeVoe, Abraham is a contraction of Abraham, meaning my father is exalted, the name being found not only in the Canaanitish Ras Shamra texts, but even in Egypt and Cyprus. Albright sees it in Abam Rama, a West Semitic name meaning he is exalted with respect to father. That is, he is of distinguished lineage. So even the name Abraham shows this idea of relating to the fathers, being a part of this lineage of people, basically the lineage of the patriarchs. So it fits in really well with what we know from ancient writings. So verse 5, let's go into verse 5 here. He says, my fathers, having turned from their righteousness and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshiping of the gods of the heathen, utterly refused to hearken to my voice. So again, his fathers, meaning Terah and others, that they kind of went away from the patriarchal order, from the real priesthood, and turned into more secular religions and idol worship and things. So again, here's another one. Humility quote from the book of a new approach to the book of Abraham. You got to realize Humility wrote 4 books about Abraham in Humility's collected works. There are 4 books, 4 volumes on just Abraham and this book of Abraham. So there's a lot of stuff. But he says this, he says, in all accounts, Terah, the father of Abraham, is solidly on Nimrod's side, as in the book of Abraham version, and is usually presented as a high official at the court. So Terah wasn't just some guy. Terah had status officially in the courts with Nimrod, who was the king priest, supposedly from the line of Ham, that had the false priesthood, if you remember, and was trying to make himself the king greater than God, basically. He says here, according to the book of Abraham, Abraham's family had long been following idolatrous practices. There is much apocryphal substantiation for these statements. Abraham, says the Midrash, which is a Jewish ancient document, had no trust either in the words of his father or in the words of his mother. Now, when he said to his father and his people, what are these images to which you are so devoted? They said, we found our fathers worshiping them. He said, indeed, you yourselves, as well as your fathers, have been in manifest error. So again, when he said, why are you worshiping them? Everybody said, that's just the tradition. That's just what everybody else did. So we're doing it too. And he's like, well, yeah, you're all wrong though. That's the problem. You think you're right because of tradition, but you're not actually right because of the teachings. So he says, it was especially in the days of Serug, Abraham's great-grandfather, that the fear of idols came into the world and the making of idols. The people being at that time subjected to the terror and confusion of the great migrations, without teachers or leaders. Remember the Tower of Babel, disruption of communications, everybody went their own ways, they were confused. And it was especially at Ur that the prince, Mastema, or Satan, exerted himself to do all this to make the people zealous in the business of idols. And he sent forth other spirits. Therefore, Sero was called Serug, for everyone was turned to do all manner of sin and transgression. So talking about basically that Satan convinced everybody to worship idols, to get them to do something religious without going the right direction, basically, kind of a false religion. Now, here's something that really was interesting about Abraham and this idea he was against idols. So there are some really cool stories on this. Abraham's 2 attacks on the idols are both very well attested in the documents. So this is Abraham's going against this idol worship idea, basically. And he nearly says, in one story, the hero at the age of 10 or 12 or 20 or 40 or 50 or 60 goes forth to sell the idols that his father and brother have made in order to help out the stringent finances of the family. So you got to realize Abraham's time, you remember there was the great wind that blew all the water back during Noah's time to pull back the waters from the flood. The heat and the wind that dried up all the water continued to persist. And now it's caused drought and famine. So it was a hard time to live. They struggled financially. The area used to be very fertile, and now it's not anymore, basically. So that's kind of what they're doing. He's out doing the family business. He's out being the salesman, selling the products. And he says, in discussing things with his customers, he points out to them the folly of worshiping dumb idols made by men, and ends up converting some of them and even dragging the idols in the dirt. In the other story, Abraham arises by night and burns all the idols in the shop, and even those in the house and family. This, according to some, was when the lukewarm Nahor, the brother of Abraham, who had announced that he would wait to see who came out on top in the struggle between Abraham and Nimrod and declare his allegiance to the winner, was burned to death trying to put out the fire. But the most common version was Abraham pleads sickness when the family goes off to the great festival at Nimrod's palace. Being left behind and finding himself alone with the idols, he destroys them. Terah, on his return, is enraged, and Nimrod even more so when he learns what has happened. But Abraham answers all questions by insisting that the idols fought amongst themselves and destroyed each other. If the objection to that is the idea that it is impossible and absurd that Abraham's accusers have called the idols helpless, with their own mouths. So that's fascinating that he kind of gets out of this, because like, why did you destroy the idols? And he said, I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves. They fought each other to see who's the dominant idol, and they all died. So here's the conundrum, because if idol worship is baloney, then Abraham's lying, and they need to call him out for that. But they have to admit the idols are dumb in order to admit that Abraham's lying. So if they go along and let Abraham lie, then they can't punish him for something he didn't do, but then they have to admit the idols are real. So he got him in a conundrum here. That's pretty fascinating. If the objection to that is I just read that. This is the sort of clever agadah that the schoolmen love. In one tradition, Abraham goes right into the national shrine and smashes idols. The soberest version is that of Maimonides. Abraham, when he was 40, began to refute the inhabitants of Ur of the Chaldees. He broke the images and commenced to instruct the people. When he had prevailed over them with arguments, the king sought to slay him. He was miraculously saved and immigrated to Haran. The stories of selling the idols or of smashing them in the shop or the shrine may be regarded as etiological tales, explaining how it was that Abraham came to argue with the people and how he finally came to his dramatic confrontation with Nimrod. Everything leads up to that. So a lot going on in his life. He realizes that this is just a bunch of hogwash, the idol worship stuff, and he's following the truth that he has sought himself that personal testimony of. And he realizes that I need to follow the truth, and I got to help these people get rid of these terrible ideas they have. Now, verse 6, for their hearts were set to do evil, talking about his father, so Terah and them, and were wholly turned to the god of Elkanah, and the god of Libnah, the god of Machmarah, and the god of Korash, the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So something that Hunebli said in here, he says, Abraham's Ur of the Chaldees was most likely located in northern Syria, called by the Egyptians Naharina, where Egyptian influence was at times strong. So if he's living in northern Syria, if you look on the map, you can see where Syria is, northern Syria, but they're worshiping the god of Pharaoh, the idols of Pharaoh, basically. There's still a lot of Egyptian influence up there. He says, the book of Abraham explicitly states that the festivities were a joint Egyptian and Canaanite undertaking, with the four great gods of the region joining with the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So in verse 6, when he gives these to us, these gods, the god of Elkanah, Libnah, Machmarah, and Korash, and the god of Pharaoh, don't sound like much. But when we really look at this and understand that these are the main idols, these are the main gods that people worship through this area, not just Egypt, but also these other parts of Mesopotamia into the Canaanitish areas. So he's really talking about how there's all of these idols, all these major gods have come that they're worshiping, basically. Now let's go to verse 7. Therefore they turned their hearts to the sacrifice of the heathen and offering up their children unto these dumb idols. So that's that same idea of sacrificing kids to the idols that they tried to sacrifice Abraham to, and hearkened not unto my voice, but endeavored to take away my life by the hand of the priests of Elkanah. The priest of Elkanah was also the priest of Pharaoh. So they're tying this together. Now we actually have an image of this. This is facsimile number 1, the book of Abraham, where Abraham is shown on the lion couch being sacrificed by a priest of Elkanah who is a priest of Pharaoh. So we're gonna do a whole video just on facsimile number 1 to get more into that detail. What's interesting is when you look at this facsimile, Hunebli found something interesting about this. So I want to share this here while we're talking about it. He says, similarly and strikingly, in a book produced by an uneducated farmer at the very time when the discipline of Egyptology was being born across the Atlantic Ocean, the Book of Abraham correctly identifies the Egyptian crocodile deity Sobek as the idolatrous god of Pharaoh. So what Hunebli just said in there was, at the same time that the concept of Egyptology, or the study of ancient Egypt, was just starting in America, Joseph correctly interprets and understands the symbol of the crocodile in Egyptian understanding. That is powerful. How in the world would Joseph know that the crocodile was a symbol of the god of Pharaoh without ever knowing Egyptian, without ever knowing Egyptian history or anything? Because most scientists at the time didn't fully understand it either. He correctly figured it out before everybody else did. Does that mean he's a savant or a prophet of God receiving revelation? Pretty cool. The book of Abraham tells of an attempted sacrifice of the patriarch. While the Bible is silent regarding the incident, post-biblical literature repeatedly mentions Abraham's miraculous deliverance from an attempt to kill him. So in apocryphal writings, we find numerous stories of Pharaoh trying to sacrifice Abraham. It's not in the Old Testament, but it's in the other stuff, the apocryphal writings, as well, that we've found through archaeological stuff, all of which was found after Joseph Smith gave us his writings, the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price. Cool, isn't that? That all of this can be corroborated, and even though Joseph Smith was way ahead of his time, he gave us this stuff and it can now be proven. If Joseph Smith or a current prophet had given us the Pearl of Great Price today, they would be seen as a hack because we have so much information now, you could put this story together. So if President Nelson, let's say, says, great, we found a new book of Abraham and I translated it and here's what it says, the scholars would look at it and go, but we already know all this. You could have literally copied all this down from all these other books. So you're just a plagiarist. This doesn't prove you're a prophet. That's what would happen today. But when Joseph Smith gave us these writings, that knowledge did not exist to corroborate what he gave us. When he gave us the book of Abraham, everybody thought he was a hack because it didn't match up with the Bible. But now we have tons of evidence to show that what he gave us does match with actual antiquities. It might not be in the Bible, but it matches very well with what's there. And none of that evidence existed when Joseph gave us this information. Really cool, really fascinating stuff. Okay, let's do verse 8. And now at this time it was the custom of the priest of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to offer upon the altar which was built in the land of Chaldea for the offering unto these strange gods, men, women, and children. So they weren't just sacrificing kids, they were sacrificing adults as well. Here's another interesting quote that comes in. Hunebly puts this in his book, Abraham in Egypt. He says, we begin with the famous Benteresh or Baktan Stele. It tells how it had been the custom of Pharaoh to make a trip every year to Naharina, where all the local rulers would hasten to pay him homage, rivaling each other in the richness of their gifts. So they would go to this part of northern Israel, near where Abraham lived, to the other kings would come together and because Pharaoh, Egypt was the big superpower country in the area at the time, they came to pay tribute to Pharaoh basically. So that's what's going on here. Now stela is those tall, skinny, obelisk type looking things where they have all these writings on them and stuff. That's what those are. They're all over the place in Egypt. Or at least used to be. They're kind of scattered all over now. He says on one occasion, the great idol Khonshu of Thebes, as the special god of Pharaoh, was sent to that land to heal the daughter of the king of Baktan. Having miraculously fulfilled its mission, the image was retained in the land for over 3 years, during which time the gods of the surrounding regions, i.e. their idols, would come to Baktan to attend solemn annual rites in its honor. So the other idols are being brought to pay homage to this main idol that did this miracle. Finally, the god Khonshu appeared to the king of Baktan in a dream in the guise of the Horus hawk, Pharaoh himself, in which form he flew back to Egypt. The king took the hint and returned the idol to Thebes with accumulated glory. The Benteresh romance receives support from a better attested historical event of the same type, namely the account of how the Lord of Mitanni, also in Naharina, sent his beautiful daughter, now some believe it was none other than the gorgeous Nefertiti, to Egypt to become the wife of the aged and luxurious Amenhotep III, excuse me, I think I said that wrong. she brought with her the image of Ishtar of Nineveh, the idolatrous deity of another great king, to heal the ailing pharaoh and to become a center of missionary activity. The ancient correspondence arranging the affair recalls that the same Ishtar of Nineveh had made such a courtesy call to Egypt years before under an earlier reign and had at that time been greatly honored in the land. Right on the border between Egypt and Canaan was discovered the so-called Al-Arish shrine, a naos cut from a single block of granite and covered with inscriptions telling an epic tale to which we shall refer below. Here it suffices to recall that the happy ending of the story calls for a great celebration in Memphis, to which Pharaoh invites or rather summons all the Asiatics to be present before the throne of the universe where stand the 4 idols of Pharaoh. So again, we find the 4 idolatrous gods of Pharaoh meeting together with Canaanites and Egyptians in a great common year rite. From all this, it would appear that the situation depicted and explained in the book of Abraham with the idolatrous gods of a country, for which the designation Ur of the Chaldees can now be fully justified, participating in yearly sacrificial rites involving both Egypt and Canaan, far from being a wild fantasy of Joseph Smith, was really the correct routine situation. So again, Joseph Smith gave us information about ancient traditions that nobody knew at the time, and then decades later we find out about. And now it's common knowledge when you look at Egyptian history and Mesopotamian history to look at some of this stuff. But it wasn't known in Joseph's day, and he accurately showed us what it was, what was going on, without any of that prior knowledge. So cool. So cool. Joseph is a true prophet. So awesome.